All right, so my talk today is about do AI language models solve verbal analogies like children do? And I had great ambitions with this project, but I must say right now it's still very much ongoing. And we're collaborating right now with Matilda Terfane. She's a master's thesis student who's actually right over there in the room trying to fix the last slide. And then Susanna Demoy is one of the attendees here. And she was a postdoc at the UvA and now works as a postdoc elsewhere. And she is very familiar with how we're going to use a large, like an online learning platform, data from an online learning platform. And she helped me get that data. And then Laura Jones, who gave a talk here in, I believe it was June, she also talked with us about it because we looked at some of the same factors that she had looked at with adults of how that influenced children's analogical reasoning. And then Rochelle Shuni is also here, and she is a PhD student with Katja Shutova, and they both specialize in language models, computational linguistics and language models, and also analogy in these models. Okay, so one of my favorite researchers in this field is Melanie Mitchell, and she, in her book and in papers, has shown that AI is far from capable of analogical reasoning or abstraction. And while my background started off in developmental psychology, I also studied computer science, and I'm curious how children's development can inform us about provide insights to improve AI systems and vice versa. What can we learn about children? Can we use AI models in some way as models of children's learning, or maybe to better understand and support analogical reasoning in humans? Now, probably most of you have heard of the relational shift, Gantner's relational shift. And although there's a whole lot of nuances in this, I think the big picture is that there's maybe gradual, influenced by a whole lot of things, but there's a shift in children's reasoning from more associative strategies to analogical solutions. And with associative, I mean a focus on surface similarity or a relationship with one other object or entity in the analogy, rather than more the higher order relation, the more abstract relation to solve the problem. And here's an example from one of Thibault's papers. We have bird is to nest as dog is to either kennel, bone, apple, or egg. And the kennel is the correct answer, at least for children who live in places where there's yards, not like Amsterdam, because my kids would not know that dogs could live in kennels. But that would be the analogical solution. I realize that birds actually live in trees and not in nests, but okay. And then dog is to bone is a very strong associative response. Apple is just a distractor that has nothing to do with the analogy. And egg is strongly associated with nest. Whenever we talk about associative responses, then I'm talking about bone or egg, and then the analogical response would be the kennel. Now, the funny thing is that this associative to analogical, it occurs in every kind of analogy that I've presented to children. So I've, for example, and sorry about the quality, it's not sharp, but here you see a small blue elephant, and here is a small yellow one. And here's a larger blue horse. Okay, so I'd say to kids, this picture changes to this one. What should this picture change to? And then they can construct the solution based on, they have little pictures of elephants and horses in different sizes and in different colors, and then they can drag and drop the responses into the empty box. And children, when they first start out, I haven't worked with this much, just a little bit with 3-year-olds, but mostly 4 to 6-year-olds. And when they first start out, they do associative responses. They either literally copy the little yellow elephant here, or they copy the horse, the blue horse. And after a few tries, even without feedback, then there's a shift and they start to do this correctly. But then if I continue and I give them more difficult questions, like, and let me go ahead and do this so that you can see it better, give them more difficult questions like this one, when there's a change in orientation and quantity. And here there's only a change in size in an animal. Then suddenly they revert to this copying. So the youngest children tend to revert to the copying. Perhaps older, and there's some other factors which I'll mention in a minute, they, instead of copying, they try to solve the analogy, and they'll provide, say, 2 small yellow horses looking in the other direction, but then they miss one aspect, which would be a partial analogical. But then I would say it's an analogical reasoning strategy, but then not the correct response. But we see they're on the right track. And then, of course, some will solve it correctly. Now, what is that influenced by? We see that associative reasoning is influenced. The younger kids do this, and it's like their default strategy from the start until they start to understand, with maybe different instruction, a little training, a little practice. We also see that the children with lower working memory scores or lower inhibitory control on a flanker type of task where they have to, I would say it's a selective attention task. Also children, whenever we're talking about verbal analogies, the ones with less domain knowledge, and also on the more difficult items. And then we're even talking about the older children, higher scores, but then they can default to go back to these associative strategies. And then there's a whole range of mixed things that are somewhere in between or partial solutions. And then we analogical reasoning, then we have older kids with better or supported working memory, depending on how the setup is of the task. And there's the influence of context, there's the influence of domain knowledge, just easier items, more practice. Okay, so this is how I see there seems to be a shift, and I still think it's, I know that some researchers think this is gradual, others talk about more of a stage-wise shift, and I tend to agree with older studies of Siegler and with Hosenfeld and Fulmer-Mass, who did a longitudinal study where they examined how children changed over time. And I also see this in my own research more with the figural analogies, that there's quite a shift, but it can go back and forth. It like flips back and forth depending on the broader context and individual differences. Okay, so that's analogical reasoning in children. Now, here's an item from our online game, which I'll tell some more about in a minute. But fingernail is to finger as lip is to. And most of you probably thought, hey, mouth. Some of the distractors we used in the, they're all associative distractors. So, but they are related to either to finger, which is hand, or the other three, tongue, taste, and cheek, are related to lip. I also played around with GPT-3. That's a AI language model. It's trained on pretty much the entire text on the internet, and it's really good at predicting the next phrase, or generating the next phrase that is most logical, but it does surprisingly well also with so many tasks. And of course, its reasoning isn't always spot on. With the word lip is derived from the Old English word lippa, which means mouth, but it does surprisingly well on these analogies. So fingernail is to finger, as lip is to choose tongue, mouth, taste, cheek, or hand, and it says lip is to mouth. And that's correct. Albeit that it's also true that most children get this correct, even the 3-year-olds. Then we try a different kind of analogy, a little more difficult. Body is to feet as tree is to. Choose branches, leaves, roots, trunk, or hands. And it says trunk. I had a small pilot study with children who spoke English, and that's in the Netherlands. So it wasn't a very fluent English mother tongue. It wasn't a very large number of children, but they all immediately, this was 4 to 8-year-olds, all immediately responded roots. And we asked GPT-3, why is trunk the correct response? And because it is the main body of the tree, just as feet are the main body part of a person. So not quite right. And we see with these types of analogies that even these huge large language models that can do so many impressive feats still can't do the analogical reasoning as these little kids can. Okay, so I did a small pilot study with a small number of children, a small number of analogies, and with one large language model, and this was all in English, just to get a feel for, hey, when GPT-3 makes mistakes, is it also what we would characterize as associative reasoning? And let's see. So to sum up, with 4 to 6-year-olds, the errors we see are they're distracted by the C term, which would be in fingernail is to finger, as lip is to question mark, then that would be lip. And they do associative reasoning. And there's also a real problem with lack of domain knowledge. Now, with GPT-3, the errors seem also to be due to some sort of semantic similarity to A, B, or C, and it's even often with C, which I think is impressive, that it realizes I shouldn't associate with A and B, but it's C is what I've got to solve. And it's unclear to me whether it's due to domain knowledge or distractor salient, like how salient, how semantically strongly associated the alternatives are to the C term. So for example, in dog is to bark as sheep is to bleat, GPT-3 responded woof. And I thought, well, is bleat not often enough in the corpus, or is this an associative response, but due to the semantic similarity? And this is something that you can, of course, test how much domain knowledge a large language model has. And we do this, but let me go on to now the bigger study that I wanted to talk about today. What you see here is it's the homepage, or part of the homepage of OpenWeb. It's a large, it's an online learning, adaptive learning platform for children in the Netherlands. There is Rekentuin, which means math garden, Taalzee, which means language sea, and Words and BERT-je, which is where they basically practice translating Dutch to English and back. But our focus today is on language sea, and in particular, the verbal analogies game. And in language C, there are 870 verbal analogies in the game. And for just this one game, we have over 14,000 children who solved at least 20 of these items in the time that we, between the dates that we selected, we did this study. And they were 6 to 13-year-olds. A big limitation here is that these were, the verbal analogies were using words that the children had to be able to read. So there were some 6-year-olds, but most 6-year-olds in the Netherlands, that's whenever they really just start to learn to read. And so with 7, they can do this task, but it's really even the older children that have both the domain knowledge and the reading skills to complete this task. Average age was 11 years with a standard deviation of a year. Now, here is the interface in language C, the verbal analogies game. We have sweater is to clothing, so that's trui is to kleding, as armband, which is a bracelet, is to, and then the options are jewelry, color, animal, plant, or ring. And down at the bottom, you see these coins. So this also means that they, this is a timer actually. And the faster you solve it, the more points you get. And so this system is, so the ability is dependent upon not only having the correct answer, but also how quickly you solve it. So it takes a speed accuracy trade-off and cognitive tasks into account. The other important thing to know about this is that it's adaptive system. So children are presented with items that they have about a 70% chance of solving correctly. So they don't get all of those 870 analogies. They only solve the ones that they're capable of, likely to solve, somewhat, yeah, pretty likely to solve. And because we also take the speed into account, then we get a very accurate ability rating. And there's, let me think if there's something else that I should say about this. We see the item and the child as, we use a rating system that is adaptive, and the children, it's like seeing the player playing against the item. And then we use the ELO rating system from chess to compute the ability. And I'll just put it this way. In this sense, we get very accurate item difficulties without having all the children solve all the items. And it's all on a linear scale, whereas the number of correct is not necessarily a linear scale. And but that's yeah. If you want to know more about that, then I can tell about that later. So anyway, the correct response is jewelry. And I had a slide where GPT-3 also got jewelry, but apparently I hid it. So you can't see that right now. But GPT-3 could also solve this one. Now, so back a few months ago, Laura Jones presented her work on what influences adults' ability to solve verbal analogies. And our first research question is, does children's performance depend on these same factors? And then the second research question is, how do these Dutch large language models perform compared to children and each other? Okay, first I'm going to go into the children's performance. So the 3 factors that Laura Jones found were that There's an influence of relation, the type of relation. Categorical, she looked at categorical relations, causal relations, and compositional relations. And causal was the most difficult for people. Let's see. She looked at the distance between the base and the target domain. Near analogies are easier than far analogies. Makes sense. She looked at distractor salience. Distractor salience, as you can imagine, is how salient are the distractors, how much. She used a semantic distance to compute this, and how much closer is, say, one distractor to the C term that compared to the D term to the C term. And she looked at different interactions, and she found a whole lot of significant effects. Also a three-way effect. So what did we find in our data set with children? So right here on the left, I have a picture from the Jones paper where causal was the hardest for adults, compositional was in between, and categorical was the easiest. And I apologize that my my graph is not so clear here. On the left, we have categorical. In the middle, we have causal, and on the right, we have compositional. The only clear effect is that causal analogies were more difficult than for children. Categorical and compositional, there was no difference. So it follows a little bit of the same pattern as for adults, but not quite. If Laura was here, then she would tell you there's some explanations for this because of the different types of compositional analogies, but yeah, the most important is that causal really is also for children the most difficult, which we would expect. Then the effect of a distance between the base and the target domain. With children, we see here is the mean. That's this line represents the mean, and these are violin plots that show the distribution. And we see that near analogies are easier for children than far analogies, just as with adults. Here we see the fact of distractor salience. Now, this is something that we would kind of expect to be really clear for kids. But there was no effect of distractor salience here. You would expect that highly distracting options, children would more easily choose those, but we didn't see a main effect of this. And then but we did find an effect of the interaction between near versus far with distractor salience. So when there's a low distractor salience, so low is these blue ones, analogies, far analogies, so where the distance between the target, the base domain and the target is far, then these low distractor salience, so basically the answer options that have less to do with it, makes it easier to solve it correctly. Makes sense, right? Or is it unclear? Because please feel free to speak up. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. So it's similar, the interaction is similar to adults, and otherwise we didn't find any significant interactions. And yeah, we're still working on making some nice plots for this. Is it there? Okay. And you can come join me when you're finished. I'm talking to Matilda, who's the master's student. Go ahead and come over here, Matilda, so that they can see you. stick your head in the camera. Here's the camera and wave. This is Matilda. She's a master's thesis student, and she is the one who ran a lot of the code for collecting data with these large language models. And she did an excellent job. And we are also really happy that Rochelle and Katja helped us with it, because what a mess sometimes trying to get them all to work and to get the correct responses. There's a whole lot of nuances with it. But how do large language models work? Well, they're these huge neural networks, and they're trained on huge amounts of text. And basically, it's like a regression after regression after regression in order to predict the next word or fill in the blank. And that's what they're really good at. Now, how do, yeah, I need to, this is a slide that Matilda just replaced, so I'm gonna stop the share and then restart it, and then probably you'll be able to see it. I hope you agree with it. Well, let's see. Where is it? Shape. Yes. Yeah, okay. Present, and then we go to, I apologize. Let's see. And I have to press the share screen button. Where are you? There you are. Yeah, I know I'm keeping you in spawning. I can't remember what the word is in English. It's like a cliffhanger, I guess. And we'll do this, and then am I sharing entire screen share? Yeah, okay. Da-da-da-dum. And what? Okay, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about this. So we used Dutch large language models. They are trained on way less data. There's far less data available on the internet. And so they're trained on way less data, and domain knowledge was a huge problem. So they, there was no point even in comparing them. I mean, we can compare them to children, and the children way outperform them in every way. And what we have here is an overview of the different language models that we tested with all of the 870 analogies, but also with the selection of analogies from the that fell into the three categories that Jones used. And yeah, their accuracy is the highest is for GPT-2, which is a predecessor of GPT-3 that I showed you, and Fasttext, which is a vector model, which we can, yeah, if you're interested, we can discuss more about what the differences are between these models and their performance. And we tried to do analyses like we had done with the children to see the effect of distractor salience, of relationship type, and what was the third one? Relationship type, distractor salient. Oh yeah, and near far. Yeah. So what happened is that, like, whenever it doesn't know the word, then we had to remove that analogy from the analysis, and then we had too few analogies that we could do. You, surprisingly enough, could do good analyses with, because it was three factors were involved, and then you need to have at least 5 analogies within each cell, and that didn't occur. And we did see that near was easier than far for all of these models. We saw that yeah, it was hard to do distractor salience. We didn't, we weren't able to analyze that in the high versus low condition. And the last part, yeah, I keep getting distracted.
The categories?
The categories. So do you remember what the result for the categories was?
Not, it was very different over the different language models.
Yeah, the language models differed greatly. And I remember that that they seem to be better at the categorical, the best at the categorical analogies. So now we presented what our preliminary findings are, and I'm curious to go into discussion with you guys to see if you have further questions about what we've found so far, and if you have some thoughts and ideas of how to proceed, or are interested in collaborating on a part of this. We'd love to know. So I'm going to stop the share and open up the floor for discussion.